Dear friend of museum, I have to speak today in English. Yesterday, Congress of Russian American had 50 years of existing, and we today have a 50th Friends of Museum meeting.
Oh.
And we are very happy to have in our museum Maria Sakovich. But at the beginning, while we are waiting for other people who...
Recovery.
Recovery. Yes. So I want to invite Евгений Солонин.
Добрый день всем, дамы и господа. И я хотел бы сделать замечательный подарок музею, передать Маргарите. Это гравюра 1828 года царя Александра I прижизненная, и она очень редкая, необычная, поэтому я считаю, что такая вещь должна быть находиться в музее, и мы хотели бы сделать вам подарок, пожалуйста.
Большое спасибо. А можно ее раскрыть?
Пожалуйста, конечно.
А можно ваша... помочь? Помогите, да, уже заодно. О, это интересно, это неизвестно. Спасибо большое.
Там есть подпись.
Там есть подпись, это, скорее всего, французский автор. Там можно сделать больше исследования, посмотреть, кто был автор этой гравюры. Там на заднем плане это показано 1812 год, деревня, там повозки, солдаты и вот такая цветная гравюра. Мы когда поменяли стекло, то они удивились о том, что ей почти 200 лет, но цвета так хорошо сохранились. По всей видимости, она лежала где-то в чулане, и цвета оригинальные, и, скорее всего, даже рама тоже оригинальная. Так что такая очень уникальная, редкая вещь. Мы не встречали, поэтому вместо того, чтобы она находилась дома, эта гравюра пусть лучше будет находиться в музее, чтобы все люди видели.
Это не прекрасный подарок.
А? Это гравюра. Ну, гравюра, литография, то же самое.
Но иногда они бывают больше, чем одна. Они по номеру, можно сказать.
Вы знаете, я делал research, I couldn't find any other like this. Да, она уникальная, она может быть, как говорится, достоянием любого музея, потому что второй я не нашел такой. Там, может, было limited edition, но за 200 лет, вы понимаете, много ушло.
I want to thank Alex, Margarita, and Eve for inviting me to come to speak today, and there's something rather nice about being number 50 in this series. I always wondered who these boys were with my grandfather. He's almost in the center back, and his regent, M.E. Krina. In the early 90s, I was finally able to identify these kids. I've seen lots of pictures in family albums, and usually there's at least one kid I recognize, if not more. So here were these boys. I was able to link a photo from the San Francisco Chronicle to the snapshot, which was taken by an unidentified photographer. The young man on the far right in the news clipping matches the young man in the snapshot. He might be Yevgeny Zaraborkin. My grandfather was the rector of Holy Trinity Cathedral between 1918 and 1931 when he died prematurely. In his pastoral journal about these children, he wrote, Russian children arrived from Vladivostok, 780 boys and girls, ages 6 to 18. The American Red Cross is taking them on the Japanese steamer Yomeimaru to Petrograd, where they are awaited by their parents. In 1918, these school children from Petrograd were evacuated to the Ural Mountains. Because of the fratricidal war, the American Red Cross took them under its protection and brought them to Vladivostok, where the children were attending schools. In San Francisco, he continues, the children spent a week, it was actually 4 days, in the Presidio. On August 3rd, the city arranged a reception in the evening with music and programs and dances. On the evening of August 4th, at the wharf on the pier, I served a molitva before the beginning of the journey. A choir of nurses sang the sermon, Preserving Religion in the Hearts of Children. A cogent summary, barest details, and no commentary. According to the San Francisco Chronicle, Father Vladimir devoted his entire time to these visiting Russian children and acted as their interpreter. Spending time with these boys was not part of his pastoral duties, as was the molitva. What drew them together? Note the 3 mandolins and the balalaika that the boys are holding. Was it the music? Father Vladimir loved music. He also had a very good voice. Before choosing to become a missionary priest, Father Vladimir taught school for a number of years in Libava, Latvia. The photo, to me at least, also shows a strong connection to the non-Russian community. The talk today reflects my 30 years interest in the story. I haven't been researching it for 30 years, not by any means, but it keeps coming back to my mind, to my consciousness as things in the broader world take place. The story of these children and their rescue by the American Red Cross is extraordinary in itself, and that will be the main topic of my talk. But I want to note that researching this history has introduced me to the history of humanitarian relief, especially the work of the American Red Cross and YMCA in Civil War Russia. The rescue of the Petrograd children takes place within the larger framework of the Red Cross's Siberian Commission, 1918 through 1920, and within the eventual U.S. State Department ban on working in Soviet Russia. There are also 2 epilogues to the story. One is what happens to the children in the USSR as they're growing up. And number 2, the development, there's a historiography develops about this odyssey. I won't have time to go into that today. I've also come to realize that the separation of children from parents, families, is a historical topic of many facets. It seems also to be a feature of the 20th and 21st centuries, at least. Circumstances have varied, often wartime, but not exclusively so. It's even going on today, and I shall mention 2 current instances. But let's go back to the winter of 1916-17. The war that Russia was fighting with its allies, Great Britain, France, and eventually the United States, was not going well for the empire. Losses mounted on the battlefield, and lives on the home front changed, especially in the capital now called Petrograd. By the winter of 1916-17, and this is a photo from that winter, there were tremendous food shortages, fuel shortages, the railway system was collapsing, medicine hard to find, and that February the weather in Petrograd hit 35 degrees below zero. Political life, as we all know, was changing drastically. Tsar Nicholas II abdicated in March 1917. The provisional government took over and tried to hold things together and continue the country's participation in the war. Soviets, councils of workers and soldiers gained considerable power. The Bolsheviks took control in October or November 1917. In March 1918, the Bolsheviks signed a peace treaty with Germany. Unstable living conditions, unstable times. Living conditions for ordinary people got worse, shortages increased. An element of lawlessness took over. Men with guns could be drunken soldiers, self-styled revolutionaries, commissars with newly acquired power. Toward the end of winter 1917, most of the schools had shut down because there was no heat. Pretty dismal conditions. A group of parents working under the auspices of an organization established at the beginning of the Great War called the Union of Towns created a plan to bring respite for school-age children. Send the kids to an area where there was ample food and less danger and where they could continue their school lessons. Reliable teachers and school personnel, as well as medical staff, would be in charge of this summer camp. It is a very Russian custom to send children off to the countryside for the summer. My own babushka offered San Francisco Russian children in the 1920s and maybe later places at my grandparents' very modest dacha in Fairfax for a week or two. The place chosen for the Petrograd children was on the eastern side of the Ural Mountains, the town of Myas. Many parents wanted to take advantage of this respite, some even requesting that school-age siblings come along as well. And the youngest member of what became the Petrograd Children's Colony was 3 years old at the beginning. A few mothers also came along as staff. By May 1918, nearly 900 children were enrolled in the program. And this was totally supported by the new Bolshevik government. Fees were charged, but nobody was turned away if they didn't have enough money. The first contingent, 475 children, left Petrograd on the 18th of May. A train journey normally would have taken 2 days and a night to travel 500 miles. Instead, the trip took 3 weeks. The second contingent, 420 children, left a week later, and it took also a much longer time. The colony trains had very low priority on the tracks. They had to give way to military trains, food transport trains, and to regular passenger trains, which were jammed with soldiers leaving the front and wanting to get home. Sometimes the delays were days long. The second train, in fact, never made it to its intended destination, a town further east of Myas, because fighting had broken out at the location. At the last minute, one of the teachers managed to leave his train, jumped onto a passenger train, and he found another site for the children's encampment, Kuri. In both locations, the children settled into a routine. School lessons in the morning, outdoor activities in the afternoons, concerts and plays in the evening that the children put on to entertain each other. Soon, however, fighting broke out in the area between the Czech soldiers who were on their way to Vladivostok and Bolsheviks. Lawlessness took over in Kuri as well. The Civil War was brewing. A feature of Russian education that helped the children to cope as they had to adjust to the various changes they would encounter for the next 2 years was the importance put on performance, plays, choirs, singing in general, and orchestra, and of course dances. Children loved these activities. Being absorbed in performance is pleasurable for its own sake, but it also affords a distraction from the difficulties that these children and staff encountered. Another practice that enabled the movement of the children from one place to another more safely and helped to diminish possible trauma as the Civil War heated up was the requirement that older children adopt and take care of a younger child if they didn't have their own siblings to take care of. While they were on the first part of this, what became an odyssey, an unexpected benefit took place for the children at Kuri. They were able to purchase flour to send home to their families in Petrograd. Letters of thanks from their parents enclosed more rubles to continue this new trade. The kids learned to buy sugar from the town merchants, take it out to peasant households in the countryside, and exchange sugar for flour, which they mailed back to Petrograd. This summer idyll came to an end as white forces and the new Red Army, as well as the Czechoslovak soldiers, claimed each other's territories. Kuri, which had been briefly occupied by the Czechs, some of the children witnessed the execution of Red Army soldiers and themselves got caught in the crossfire. The colony's food supplies began to dwindle. The Soviet rubles that had purchased needed goods lost their value. Contact was lost with the children's parents, and a return journey at this time became impossible. The state of the railroads was terrible. So much for starting school in September in Petrograd. Unfortunately, neither the children nor any of the adults had brought winter clothing. The children were separated into various groups, and I've underlined, I don't know if you can see it in the back, the places where they ended up. They were split into groups with teachers or other staff and settled into various locations, including a convent, a Cossack village, a railway town. The locations were spread out, as you can see, geographically. A few adults actually abandoned the children or went to work to bring in necessities, which meant less supervision for some kids. Others, some found willing helpers in the communities where they ended up, but others did not, and reports of poorly dressed children in small groups scrounging for food began circulating. Some of the conditions had become quite grim, constantly changing battle lines, epidemic typhus, as well as the lack of supervision, lack of food, and lack of adequate clothing. Enter a young couple, Alfred and Yekaterina Swan, who also had left Petrograd for the same reasons as the children. They had left a month earlier. They wanted to get away from the street violence, the hunger, the uncertainty, and they wanted to find some normality. Alfred had grown up bilingual and bicultural in a British family living in St. Petersburg for several generations. They worked as teachers and translators. They were pacifists, Tolstoyans. Alfred Swan was also a musician, and he would eventually become a noted musicologist and composer. The couple met some American YMCA workers who invited them to join their relief work, which they did. In mid-September, they were temporarily left in charge of the work at Chelyabinsk. The Swans also heard the rumors about the distressed children, and they, on their own, did some investigating. When they learned that the YMCA could not offer help to the colonists, they cabled to the American Red Cross, who had recently entered Siberia from the east. The Red Cross was offering help to Czechoslovaks, to members of the American Expeditionary Force that had recently arrived, to refugees fleeing the Bolsheviks, and to members of the white forces under Admiral Kolchak. During their time in Siberia, the Red Cross operated anti-typhus trains, they established hospitals, they distributed medicine, food, clothing. They offered training to Russian personnel, for instance, nurses' aides, and in general brought humanitarian relief. With the promised help from the Red Cross, Alfred Swan managed to recruit 2 English Quakers and a Russian companion to help. With the supplies and the money from the Red Cross, the Swans and their new colleagues made their way to each of the colonies to assess their conditions, their needs, and provide what they could, and on occasion dismissing staff because of their ineptitude or their dishonesty. The older boys in Petropavlovsk with their teacher in the center, Pavel Voznesensky, the teacher and his wife were dismissed by the Swans. During their travels, the Swans discovered a site where they thought they could bring all the scattered groups of children together at a group of abandoned summer homes at Lake Turgoyk. The first group of children to arrive were from the Cossack village. In early May, the second group arrived with plans to bring others to this summer encampment, with the intention, of course, and this is 1919, to return to Petrograd in the fall. A thriving community emerged with help from the local government, who gave permission to use the land. Crops were planted, services established, including a hospital, workshops, all available for the inhabitants of the nearby village. The children were organized into work groups to make the enterprise a success. Again, school lessons, excursions into the countryside, music and theatricals made the summer pass quickly. Alfred Swan kept his doubts about the possible return in the autumn. During the preceding spring, the white forces had been advancing successfully, but in July they were in retreat. It became impossible to know where the fighting would break out. While the children in their various locations were not generally targets for warfare or battle, they could so easily, by mistake, get caught up in changing battle lines. Moreover, the boys who were turning 18 were at risk of being mobilized by either the Whites or the Reds. The Red Cross, and I haven't been able to travel to an archive to read about how this decision was made, but it was made to take the children from all the colonies to Vladivostok on the Pacific coast. These next 4 photos, and I will read some text that describe the journey, because it really gives an incredible sense of what the children, how resilient they were, is basically what I'm impressed with. The writer of the Red Cross report writes, Turgoyk being situated some 20 kilometers from the railroad station at Myas, it was necessary to move their children and their belongings in 60 peasant wagons which had been secured from the military authorities, loaded with the children's clothes, personal treasures, and provisions for the journey, a process that was commenced about 7 in the morning and completed by 11. The railroad station was reached about 3 in the afternoon, and here wagons were unloaded and their contents placed in big warehouses, secured through the courtesy of the Russian Red Cross, who had also made arrangements for the children's evacuation train. Then their possessions were safely stored away, pending the arrival of the train. The children, nearly 400 strong, had their supper, and then, grouped about the warehouse platform, they sang. Everywhere else there was chaos. In the midst of it, perfectly calm, perfectly disciplined, philosophically resigned to the needs of the situation, were the children, singing song after song, folk songs, ballads, and snatches of opera. I find that quite a remarkable scene. It's also, this description is very different from what Izvestia published in November of 1919 about this removal from Turkoyev. The article wrote, "The removal took place at night, and the children were given only 2 hours' notice. During the journey to the unknown location, 1 young girl drowned, many children got seriously ill. The boys over 15 years old were mobilized, presumably into the White Forces. The report concludes, the cruel and senseless treatment of the children by the Americans should prove to the parents of the unfortunate captive children what they may expect from the representatives of civilized imperialist governments." We'll come back to Soviet attitudes later. Not only was the journey east of Vladivostok potentially dangerous, there were bands of Bolsheviks trying to stop the train at several places. Semyonov's guerrillas held up the train looking for gold, but the train were also slow. Tracks were torn up, trains had to wait while tracks were put down, and the trains also ran out of wood which fueled the trains. And when I saw this Ivan Vladimir painting, exchanging material, I just had to include it because it's not the Red Cross exchanging material, but the Red Cross learned to carry bolts of material because the train crew had to go out to peasant households and bargain with the material to get old fences to use to continue the train journey. And by this time, material and other tradable goods was what the peasants would take. There was no value to the rubles anymore. Perhaps more frightening for the adults were the children who got off the train during the many long stops to play or explore, and the train started up without warning. The kids, however, had learned to report to the station master that they were under the protection of the Red Cross, and they would be put on the next passenger train. And because the Red Cross train had the lowest priority, eventually the kids would easily meet the Red Cross train. Altogether, 779 Petrograd children arrived in Vladivostok. Sorry, I didn't coordinate that very well. I'm glad I turned around. This is actually at a railroad station not far from Petrograd. "424 boys, 355 girls. There were 3 trains involved. one on the 19th of August, 2 in September. One journey took 37 days, another took 3 weeks. Enter several remarkable Red Cross workers. Riley Allen was a journalist in Hawaii in civilian life. He was now in charge of the colony. Burl Bramhall, business manager, we'll hear about him later. And Hannah Campbell, with her own 2 children, who quickly learned Russian in Vladivostok. She had been working at the Red Cross headquarters in Vladivostok in charge of the living quarters for the personnel. She was later appointed matron for the journey on the Yome Maru, in charge of meals and all kinds of details for 900 passengers. She was a wonderful, no-nonsense, but a woman with a very loving manner, and she was able to work wonders when problems arose, whether they were practical problems or tensions between people. There isn't time to delve into more about these very excellent people. One of the miracles that Riley Allen performed from Vladivostok was restoring correspondence between the children and their families via a complicated route. The letters were sent across the Pacific to the United States, then across the Atlantic to Sweden, and on to Tallinn in the newly liberated Estonia, and finally from there to Petrograd. All this before there was air mail postal service. The children assured their families that they were okay. The children spent nearly 11 months in Vladivostok at several locations, including Russian Island, in a former army barracks, now especially fit up for use by the children, and an extensive staff that include Americans, Russians, and now German and Austrian POWs seeking their return to Europe as well. They attended school. The Red Cross made sure that their education was accredited so the children could comfortably resume school in Russia when they finally returned. And it did turn out that they were excellently prepared and often were better off than the kids that they went back to and hadn't had as good an education. I wonder about this particular slide if the teacher with the 2 boys, who look to me like brothers, isn't a mother of the 2 boys. I don't think we'll ever know. The shorn heads of these little girls was a preventive measure against lice and the transmission of typhus. Two American YMCA and YW staff were in charge of physical education and recreation. Both boys and girls participated in Scouts. 15 of the oldest girls received training as nurses' aides. Some of the older children went to local high schools. And of course there was plenty of theater and music, production of plays and orchestra, choir groups formed again. One of the POWs was especially talented in scene painting for the specially constructed stage for the colony's performances. There was plenty of medical and dental care. I've seen 2 different figures about the cost per month to operate the colony. One figure is $20,000 a month in 1919-20 figures, or $35,000 a month. It's a lot of money. According to the Red Cross reports, the children thrived. Their return to normal, however, took place against a backdrop of turmoil in Vladivostok. There were changing local governments. Eventually, the American Expeditionary Force was leaving Siberia. Those from Britain and France were also leaving, and a great deal of uncertainty prevailed. Plans began to be made for the journey back to Petrograd. In April, the first train was ready, but the Japanese took over Vladivostok and the provincial governments. Few trains were arriving or leaving. Even though the railways were still in a shambles, the Red Cross did intend to cross Siberia back to European Russia. And the real stumbling block against returning the children by rail came from the U.S. State Department, who did not want American personnel traveling in Soviet Russia. Fortunately, some weeks earlier, the Red Cross personnel had begun exploring possibilities of returning the children by ship, either through the Suez Canal or the much longer route through the Panama Canal. Finding a ship proved difficult to charter. The State Department, even though it didn't permit travel, it didn't offer any help for finding an alternative transportation for the children. And interestingly, the Japanese Katsuta Steamship Company came to the rescue and enabled a ship to be chartered by the Red Cross. They paid $100,000, that is, the Red Cross did, for the conversion of the freighter to troop ship accommodations. It cost either $4,500 or $5,000 a day to charter the Yome Maru. Accommodations were very tight for the 780 children, 17 American personnel, 85 Russian staff, and 78 POWs, and of course the ship's crew. Finally, the ship left on the 13th of July, 1920. The Yome Maru arrived at San Francisco at 6 p.m. on the 1st of August. Everyone the next day disembarked except for the Japanese crew. The children were warmly welcomed with an official reception outdoors in the Civic Center. And you see the hats in the center. All of the speeches, of course, were in English. So I could imagine the children becoming restless after a certain point. There was a performance, as Father Vladimir related, in the Civic Auditorium with an audience of 8,000. This photo is from that evening. They also had the whole playground, the main playground at Golden Gate Park, for the afternoon. Hannah Campbell recollected, "No one dreamed of such hospitality. The children were wildly excited about it. There was some drama when a local police officer saved the life of 15-year-old Vera Mihailova. She had slipped between the pier and the boat. He was commended afterwards for his rescue. Only one political outburst occurred. The Chronicle reported a voice was heard shrieking, "Down with the Kolchak government! It is the murderer of children. These boys and girls are its victims." The disturber was silenced and he was taken away. The visit to San Francisco ended with a prayer service at Pier 29. Despite what the Chronicle stated, the children were not given communion. During the voyage through the Panama Canal and up the Atlantic coast, a new element brought tension to the Russian staff and the children. Riley Allen had not accompanied the children on this part of the ocean voyage. He took the train to Washington and on to New York to make arrangements for their stay. In Washington, Riley Allen learned of a change in plans, and instead of sailing directly to the Baltic states, where the return of the children would have been organized. The head of the European Commission of the American Red Cross made plans for the children to remain in France until contact could be reestablished with their families. This commissioner was mistakenly under the impression that many parents had left Petrograd and were presumably in Europe rather than in Russia. The reality was relatively few had left Petrograd. Though Riley Allen later would challenge this decision, he sent a telegram to be read to everybody on the ship. Just at this time, France was engaged in helping the new nation of Poland win back territory that had been part of the Russian Empire since the 18th century. Poland invaded Ukraine, which was trying to preserve its independence from the new Soviet Russia. Bolshevik forces pushed westwards. Russian teachers and teenage members of the colony perceived France as their enemy. Whether justified or not, this feeling made them vulnerable to suggestions and rumors. They were terribly afraid that stopping in France for any length of time would result in the older boys being conscripted to fight in the French army against Russia, and that the older girls would become white slaves. Besides, they just wanted to get home. Staying in France would be a delay, maybe even a long one. Both the teachers and the older colonists protested. The Yomemaru arrived in New York on the 28th of August. As in San Francisco, the whole group was settled into an army installation, Fort Wadsworth on Staten Island, and lots of entertainment had been arranged by local Red Cross members for the children. Here the similarity of the experience in San Francisco and New York ends. The stay in New York was much longer, 2 weeks. The children were bombarded with visitors, Tsarist Russians and Bolsheviks bringing tons of gifts, candy, food, toys, and propaganda. 2 children also died here. For a flavor of the propaganda the Red Cross, Russian teachers, and the children were subjected to, I'll read an excerpt from a memoir by Hannah Campbell. The children had been invited by a consortium of Russian groups in New York to a program at Madison Square Garden. Although the Red Cross had approved the program, there were changes that took place. After a flowery welcome, the chairman burst into a strong protest about the children being taken to France and introduced another speaker who carried on stronger. And then a third, a Mr. Martins, claimed to be the Russian ambassador to America from the Soviet government, but he had never been recognized as such by the USA. He stated that measures were going to be taken to take the children's colony out of the hands of the American Red Cross. The Red Cross was vilified, and even the American personnel. He questioned the motives of us all. I was so hurt, I was so furious and angry that I wept. I would call the whole event an acoustic melee. And a couple of the older children did stand up and go to the stage and stated their appreciation for the Red Cross. When the Yomemaru left New York on the 11th of September, the staff was short by either 7 or 16 POWs who never returned to the ship. 8 children and nurses had been claimed by family members. 2 children, as I mentioned, had died, a girl from meningitis and a boy from an accidental gunshot. 5 days into their trip into the Atlantic, a young, very popular teacher died, although she had been recovering well after surgery in New York, and Maria Gorbachova was buried at sea. When the voyage began, the final destination was not yet known. Riley Allen had made sure that the colony would not be sojourning in France, although it did stop in Brest to unload and take on new cargo, which was a way of defraying the cost of the ship. Here, 3 children and 3 nurses met family members who had emigrated to France. The next stop, 26 October, was Helsinki, then called Helsingfors. Here arrangements were made for the colony to stay at a former sanatorium built by the Russian royal family, but only after the Red Cross convinced the Finnish government to let the ship into the country. Here began the complex task of making arrangements for the children to their actual family members. Riley Allen had insisted that unless he had communication from a parent or a family member, they would not be sent back. Since there was a closed border between Finland and Russia and no formal relationship between the two, lists of the children were sent to Red Cross headquarters in Tallinn. Obviously they were also published, and to be forwarded to the Parents' Committee, which had formed in Petrograd. When the Parents' Committee got the information, they would then have to go back or send their communication to Tallinn, who sent it to the Baltic Red Cross in Riga, in Latvia, who sent the parents' letters to Captain Hopkins in charge of Red Cross activities in Finland. The first group, 138 children and 7 adults, crossed the rickety footbridge over the Chornaya Rechka, and there waited 2 hours for the Russian army soldiers to arrive and escort them to the other side. 9 more trips were made, the last taking place on the 26th of January 1921, 2.5 years after leaving Petrograd to begin their summer holiday. A total of 735 children returned to Petrograd. 43 children have been sent to other locations. The biggest countries, Estonia with 18 and Latvia with 12. And so ends the odyssey of these children, but I want to pay attention to an epilogue. Some of the children began corresponding with Riley Allen soon after their arrival home. Parents also wrote letters of thanks. One of the colonists didn't write until Christmas 1926 to send greetings. Asya Fisser wrote, "I shall never forget your great kindness to me during our trip through Siberia, Japan, and America to Finland. The memory of those happy days is very dear to me. I wanted to tell you so years ago, but couldn't write because I didn't know English. Now that I am learning, I seize the first opportunity of writing you. Don't you intend to come over here? We shall be delighted to help you in any way we can." I think it's an amazing letter. She refers to these days, happy, are very dear to me. Jane Swan, the second wife of Alfred, who had been living in Virginia since the 1920s, reported that a few colonists continued to send messages and letters to Burl Bramhall, Riley Allen, and to the Swans, that is to Ekaterina and Alfred, in the blackest time of Stalin. But at some point during Stalin's time, colonists learned to suppress the story of their odyssey publicly. Those who shared their history risked the possibility of denial to university or denial to a career path. During the purges in the late 1930s, at least one former colonist, a leading astrophysicist, was apparently executed. It was easy to target him when police discovered his personal archive of Odyssey photographs and comments. It was probably a scrapbook. During Stalin's time, not only did Soviet citizens in general stop corresponding with their relatives in the West, but former colonists, now grown up, also had to contend with the Soviet government's difficulty acknowledging that imperialist America had played an important role in helping over 800 children and staff to survive wartime conditions. Therefore, the need to suppress this remarkable odyssey. In 1953, the Soviet ballet choreographer Leonid Yakubson created this fictional but official account of these years with his two brothers, Kostya and Sergei. He wrote, in 1918, due to the famine in Petrograd, school children were evacuated to Siberia. When civil war broke out, perhaps 1,000 children were moved month after month from one Siberian city to another. For almost a year, I lived in Vladivostok, where I continued my studies. Finally, when the time came to return to Petrograd, because of the destruction of the Trans-Siberian Railway, the government sent us by steamship across the Pacific and the Atlantic Ocean. The 1960s brought a small easing to Soviet society. Jane and Alfred Swan made 2 visits with colonists in the 1960s. Burl Bramhall, however, the business manager for the colony's activities, went to the USSR in 1967, but he was unable to make any contact with the colonists. As late as 1975, by now Jane was a widow, she traveled to the USSR to interview some of the colonists. She had been asked to write their history. She was trained as a historian. But they would only be taped very, very late in the evening or early morning hours, and they asked not to be named. The story did start leaking out publicly, even in 1973, when a Pravda editor ran a series of articles because Burl Bramhall had wanted to reconnect and had come back to the Soviet Union to do that. This list, it's not complete. It lists about 600, is a gold mine of information, especially when you see the occupation of the parents and you see that the bulk of this list is primarily what we would today call working class. Bramhall wrote in a five-page summary of his visit, "We were very careful of what we had to say with newsmen present. Politics were never mentioned on either side. On this occasion, however, Bramhall received a Medal of Honor from the Russian Red Cross Society. I also have wondered if the Red Cross people ever learned that there were at least 2 marriages between colonists later on." There is a very rich historiography that is developed, but that's a subject for another talk. I just want to mention 2 very different incidents of children separated from their families that again reminded me of this whole odyssey. This odyssey and the rescue by the Red Cross was an instance where Americans took such care to return children to their parents during a time of much hand-wringing about the new Bolshevik government in Russia. But in 2018, the separation of children from migrants at the U.S.-Mexico border betrayed this 100-year-old precedent. This is a troubling place to end my presentation, but I think by exploring the Petrograd Children's Colony and its long period of children being subjected to change and danger, etc., and its rescue, an episode where adults persisted despite obstacles to do the right thing and the children thrived and grew in resilience, is worth remembering. Thank you.
I'd like to ask one question.
Please, Alex.
What was the difference, for example, in American slavery? The children were separated from their parents very often. It happened all the time.
You're absolutely right.
They spent years trying to find out who their fathers and mothers were after.
That is an excellent and extraordinarily sad example of non-wartime separation of children from parents, and it was a deliberate policy to sell the children elsewhere. Yeah. All the examples one can think about of where children are separated from parents are so varied, but inside, as a historian, I feel there is some kind of link, which is why I wanted to include that this is still going on. And the separation of the children from parents in Petrograd was with excellent intentions. It was just wartime that interfered to bring a different outcome than they expected.
Maria, I'm so happy that you are here in our museum again.
It's recorded.
Oh, I am very happy to see Natasha. Natasha Sabelnik survived after yesterday presentation. I think it was perfect. Congratulations, Natasha, again.
Thank you. I honestly thought, well, we finally got here, and it wasn't the past 50 years. It was really the past 5 months that I've been putting it on. So thank you all for coming. Wonderful group yesterday. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay.